There is something happening in the final moments of human consciousness that science has only recently begun to measure. And what the measurements are showing is so extraordinary, so genuinely strange, so far outside what anyone expected to find, that the researchers who discovered it have spent years trying to figure out what to do with the data. Not because the data is uncertain, but because if it means what it appears to mean, then everything most people believe about the boundary between life and death, between consciousness and its ending, between this reality and whatever lies beyond it, needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. And tonight we are going to go all the way into it. The science, the stories, the impossible, overlapping experiences of two people who encountered something on the other side of ordinary consciousness that neither of them has been able to fully return from. And by the time this is over, something about how you understand your own awareness, your own existence, and the question of what consciousness actually is, and where it actually lives, will never feel quite the same again. Welcome to Quantaverse. In 2013, researchers at the University of Michigan recorded something in the brains of dying rats that nobody expected to find in the moments immediately following cardiac arrest, before the brain could have received any new sensory information, before blood flow had delivered any oxygen, before any conventional explanation for neural activity could apply. The brains of the dying animals produced a surge of gamma wave activity. Gamma oscillations, the fastest, most synchronized, most cognitively intense form of brain activity that neuroscience has ever measured. The same patterns associated with the highest states of conscious awareness. The same frequencies associated with deep meditation, peak creative experiences, and moments of profound insight, but stronger, more synchronized, more globally coherent than anything the same brains had produced during normal waking life. The dying brain, in its final moments, was more awake than it had ever been alive, and nobody knew what to do with that. And then in 2023, researchers documented the same phenomenon in human beings. Two patients who died of cardiac arrest while being continuously monitored showed identical surges of gamma activity at the moment of death. A 30-fold increase in gamma wave power in one case, a massive surge of neural synchronization in the other, occurring precisely at the moment when conventional neuroscience would have predicted the brain to be going dark. And the question that this raises, the question that nobody in mainstream science is quite comfortable asking out loud, but that the data keeps forcing back onto the table, is what is that activity for? What is that? Synchronization in the other, occurring precisely at the moment when conventional neuroscience would have predicted the brain to be going dark. And the question that this raises, the question that nobody in mainstream science is quite comfortable asking out loud, but that the data keeps forcing back onto the table, is what is that activity for? What is that surge of gamma consciousness doing? What is happening inside a brain that produces its most intense, most synchronized, most globally coherent pattern of awareness at the exact moment it appears to be ending? Lori Bennett is 43 years old. She has brown hair that she keeps shorter than she used to. She has a way of pausing before she answers questions that makes you feel like she is checking something internally before she speaks, like she is consulting a version of experience that most people do not have access to. She was in a car accident 7 years ago, a collision on a wet road at night that left her clinically dead for 4 minutes and 20 seconds before paramedics brought her back. and she has spent the 7 years since trying to explain what happened during those 4 minutes and 20 seconds in a way that the people around her can actually receive. And she has largely given up, not because she doubts the experience. She does not doubt it at all. If anything, she doubts the ordinary life she returned to far more than she doubts what she encountered on the other side of it. But because the language does not exist, because the concepts required to accurately describe what she experienced are not concepts that human language was built to carry, and because every time she tries to describe it in ordinary terms, something essential gets lost, something that was the most important part of the whole thing gets flattened into a version that sounds like a near-death experience story instead of sounding like what it actually was, which was the most real, most alive, most emotionally complete 4 minutes and 20 seconds of her entire existence. Dr. Bernard Vale is 51 years old, and he will be the first to tell you, with a self-deprecating laugh that does not quite hide the genuine anxiety underneath it, that he is not the kind of scientist who was supposed to end up in a story like this one. He is a neuroscientist who spent 20 years studying the mechanisms of memory consolidation, the unglamorous middle ground of brain science, the part that does not get documentary treatment, the part where you spend decades tracking how the hippocampus encodes episodic memory and arguing with journal reviewers about statistical methodology. And he was fine with that. He had made a kind of peace with being the scientist whose name nobody remembered at conferences, the one whose work was quietly essential and publicly invisible. And then, 3 years ago, he agreed to undergo an experimental neuroconsciousness simulation developed by a research group he had been consulting with, procedure designed to artificially recreate in a controlled laboratory setting the neural conditions of the brain's final 2 seconds before death using targeted transcranial stimulation, controlled sensory deprivation, and a specific combination of pharmacological agents that the team had spent 6 years developing. And he agreed to be the first human subject, partly because he genuinely believed in the science, and partly, he will admit now, with a laugh that does not hide the anxiety, because some part of him needed to know, needed to understand from the inside what his colleagues in the near-death research community kept describing, needed to feel rather than just measure the thing that had been sitting at the center of his professional curiosity for 2 decades. And what he found during those simulated 2 seconds changed him in ways he is still processing, in ways he suspects he will be processing for the rest of his life. Let us talk about what the gamma surge might actually mean, because the conventional explanation, the one that most neuroscience departments will offer if you ask, is that it is a dying reflex, a last desperate burst of neural activity as the system fails, the brain's equivalent of a power surge before the lights go out. And this explanation is tidy, and it fits the existing framework, and it requires no revision of what we currently understand about consciousness and its relationship to the brain. But it has a problem, and the problem is the content. Because if the gamma surge were simply a mechanical dying reflex, a random electrical storm as the system loses coherence, you would not expect the people who survive cardiac arrest and return to report anything in particular about those final moments. You would not expect them to describe organized, coherent, emotionally rich, narratively structured experiences of extraordinary vividness and complexity. You would not expect them to describe experiences that feel more real than ordinary life. more emotionally complete, more narratively coherent, more vivid, more meaningful. You would expect them to describe chaos or nothing, and instead, across thousands of documented near-death experiences from cultures and countries and belief systems all over the world, what they describe is the opposite of chaos. What they describe sounds like the most organized, most coherent, most lucid, and emotionally complete experience of their lives. And that is a problem for the dying reflex explanation, because organized, coherent experience is exactly what gamma waves are associated with during normal conscious life. The surge of gamma activity at death is not random noise. It has the signature of genuine high-level cognitive processing, and the question of what that processing is doing, what information it is processing, where the experience it appears to be generating is actually occurring, is a question that the data cannot answer within the existing framework. Lori says that the first thing she noticed, the first thing she can actually remember from the other side of the accident, was not darkness. It was not the tunnel and the light that she had heard described in near-death accounts she had read years before. It was expansion, a sudden, complete, overwhelming expansion of awareness that felt like every boundary she had ever experienced, as the edges of herself simply ceased to be relevant, as if the container that her consciousness had always lived inside had dissolved, not violently, not traumatically, more like waking from a dream to discover that the walls of the room you were dreaming inside were never really walls at all, just suggestions, habits of perception that had been organizing her experience into a manageable shape, and underneath them was something so much larger that the word larger does not adequately describe it. It was not that there was more space, it was that space itself stopped being the relevant organizing principle, and what replaced it was something she can only describe as simultaneity, everything at once. Not in a chaotic, overwhelming way, but in a way that felt completely natural, as if the linear one thing at a time structure of ordinary experience had been the artificial constraint, and this was simply how things actually were when the constraint was removed. And here is where the story gets extraordinary, because what Lori experienced in that simultaneous everything-at-once awareness was not abstract. It was not undifferentiated light or cosmic unity. It was specific, it was personal. It was her, but in dozens, possibly hundreds, possibly more versions than she can count, living dozens of lives simultaneously, inhabiting dozens of different versions of herself across what felt like dozens of different versions of reality, all at once, all equally real, all equally vivid, all equally hers, and she remembers them, not as dreams she is recounting secondhand, but as memories, her own memories, as direct and accessible as memories of her childhood or her marriage. She remembers winning the lottery in one of those lives, not in the abstract, but specifically. She remembers the specific numbers, the specific moment, the specific quality of the light in the room where she was watching the television when the numbers matched. She remembers the feeling of it, the disbelief, and then the absolute certainty, and then the laughter. She remembers the house she eventually bought beside the ocean, the specific sound of the water in the morning, the specific quality of the light through large windows. In the early afternoon, she remembers her daughter in that life, her daughter who in this life died when she was 6 years old. In that life survived, grew up, had children of her own, and Lori remembers her granddaughters, face in that other life with the same clarity and the same love that she remembers her daughter's face in this one. and she says that returning to this reality felt like a bereavement, felt like losing her daughter all over again, but worse in some ways because this time she knew exactly what she was missing. She had lived it. It was hers. It was real. And then it was gone. Bernard is listening to Lori describe this in the coffee shop, where they meet for these conversations, and he is doing the thing he does when something connects with something. He does not quite want to admit connects. He is very slightly nodding while staring at his coffee cup, and then he says, quietly, "I had the lottery dream too." And Lori looks up from her own coffee and says, "What do you mean?" And he says, in the simulation, in those 2 seconds that felt like considerably longer than 2 seconds, I was living a life where I had won something, not necessarily the lottery. It was less specific than what you're describing. It was more the feeling of having won, of having been recognized, of mattering in a way that this version of my life has mostly not provided. And he says it with a self-deprecating laugh, the one that does not hide the anxiety. And Lori says, "That's not funny, Bernard." And he says, I know it's not, but what am I supposed to do with the information that the most important professional achievement of my entire career was accidentally stumbling into a simulation of my own deepest wish fulfillment? And Lori says, maybe that's not what it was. And Bernard says, then what was it? And Lori says, maybe it was a memory. The quantum theories of consciousness have been controversial since they were first proposed, dismissed by much of mainstream neuroscience as speculation dressed in the language of physics. But they had never quite gone away, and in recent years they have begun to attract increasingly serious attention, not because they have been proven, they have not been proven, but because they keep pointing at things that the conventional theories struggle to explain. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction hypothesis proposes that consciousness arises from quantum computations occurring within microtubules inside neurons, quantum processes at the cellular level that may be genuinely exploiting the properties of quantum mechanics rather than operating purely classically. And if this is correct, if consciousness is genuinely a quantum phenomenon rather than purely a classical computational one, then the implications extend far beyond neuroscience, because quantum systems have properties that classical systems do not have. Quantum systems can exist in superposition. Quantum systems can be entangled across distance. Quantum systems are connected to the quantum field that underlies all of physical reality in ways that classical systems are not. And a quantum consciousness would be a consciousness that participates in the quantum field that is embedded in the same fabric of reality that underlies all of physical existence, not as a passenger, but as a participant, not as a recorder of a pre-existing external reality, but as something genuinely woven into the structure of what is real. Lori has a theory, and she is careful to call it a theory because she is not the kind of person who mistakes vivid experience for established fact. But the theory is this: she thinks the brain during ordinary life is functioning as a filter, not as a generator. She thinks consciousness in its full form is something significantly larger than what the brain normally allows through. And she thinks the brain's job under normal operating conditions is to constrain that larger consciousness into a manageable, survivable, functionally useful subset, the subset that allows you to navigate a body through a physical world without being overwhelmed by the full scope of what you actually are. And she thinks that what happens at death or near death or in whatever the territory is that she briefly inhabited, is that the filter loosens or fails, or is deliberately set aside, and what comes through in the absence of the filter is the full scope, the complete thing, the consciousness that is not bounded by one body and one linear timeline and one set of memories, but that has access to all of it simultaneously, all the lives, all the timelines, all the versions, all the memories. And she says the gamma surge might be the neural signature of that filter loosening. The brain's most intense burst of synchronized activity might be the last thing the filter does before it stops filtering, might be the moment the river bursts the dam, and Bernard, who has spent his career thinking about these questions from the scientific side, says quietly, that is almost exactly what some of the quantum consciousness theorists have been proposing, the brain as receiver rather than generator. And Laurie says, I know. I read it after I came back. And Bernard says, and Laurie says it felt like reading a description of something I had already experienced. It felt like reading someone else's account of something I remembered. Now, Bernard wants to tell you about the red door, but first he needs to tell you something else, and he needs to tell it in a certain order, because the order matters, and the order begins with the ocean, which is that in his simulation, in those 2 seconds that lasted considerably longer, there was a moment near what he understood to be the end of the experience where he found himself, somewhere outside the life he had been living in the simulation, outside the successful, respected, remembered version of himself, somewhere that felt like a transition, a threshold, and it was outside. It was dusk. There was water nearby. He could hear waves, and there was a door, a single red door, standing in a location where a door had no rational business standing, not attached to any building, not part of any frame, just standing, freestanding, its own thing, beside a gloomy ocean at dusk, and he remembers pausing in front of it and feeling something he has been trying to describe accurately ever since. It was not fear, it was not curiosity, exactly. It was more like recognition, like encountering something you have seen before in a context you cannot place, like the specific quality of déjà vu that is so strong it stops you in place. And then the simulation ended, and he woke up in the laboratory, and the first thing he said to the research team was, "Where is the ocean?" And they looked at him with the specific expression of scientists who are not sure whether their subject is joking. And he said, "I'm serious. I was standing beside an ocean. There was a red door." And one of the researchers said, "Bernard, there is no ocean in the simulation protocol." And he said, "I know. So where did the ocean come from?" He told Laurie about the red door 6 months after they first met at a near-death research conference where she was a guest speaker and he was presenting a paper. He told her about it as a kind of test, not to manipulate her, but because he genuinely needed to know whether the door was his, whether it was specific to his simulation, whether it had come from somewhere in his own unconscious that he could identify and categorize and file away as psychologically explicable. And Laurie did not let him finish the sentence. She said, "I know that door." And Bernard said, "What do you mean, you know that door?" And she said, "I was standing in front of it. At the end, before I came back, I was standing in front of a red door beside an ocean at dusk, and I was trying to decide whether to open it." And Bernard said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "We need more coffee." And Laurie said, "We need something stronger than coffee." And Bernard said, "I know a place." And they both started laughing in the slightly unhinged way that people laugh when they have encountered something that the ordinary categories of experience are not equipped to process. The laugh that is 3/4 genuine humor and 1/4 controlled terror. And the waiter came over to ask if everything was okay, and Bennett said we're having an existential crisis, but the eggs are. Excellent. And the waiter backed away slowly, and Lori said that another version of you probably became a terrible motivational speaker. And Bernard said almost certainly, I bet he has a podcast. And Lori said he definitely has a podcast. And they laughed again, and underneath the laughing something was shifting. Something that neither of them had names for yet was becoming more real with every conversation. Let us talk about what memory actually is at the quantum level, because the conventional understanding of memory, the one that neuroscience has been working with for decades, treats memory as a biological storage system. Experiences are encoded in patterns of synaptic connections, consolidated during sleep, retrieved when needed, modified slightly. Each time they are accessed, a physical record kept in the physical structure of the brain, and within this understanding, the memories you have are the memories of this life. This brain, this sequence of experiences, anything else would be fiction or dream or noise, but the quantum theories of consciousness suggest something different. They suggest that if consciousness is genuinely embedded in the quantum field that underlies all of physical reality, then the relationship between consciousness and memory might be more complex than the storage metaphor allows. The quantum field is not local. It does not have sharp edges, what we call individual things, individual particles, individual people, individual consciousnesses are patterns in the field, temporarily stable local excitations, not fundamentally separate objects, but local configurations of something continuous. And if that is what consciousness is, a local configuration of something continuous and non-local, then the question of what memories belong to that consciousness becomes significantly more complicated, because the field that the configuration is a part of extends beyond the configuration itself, and the question of what information is accessible to a consciousness that is genuinely embedded in a non-local quantum field is not obviously the same as the question of what information is stored in the local biological structure of one particular brain. Lori says that the hardest part is the grief, not the grief of having been close to death, not the grief of the accident itself, but the specific grief of having inhabited those other lives and then been returned to this one. She says it is like every morning she wakes up with a homesickness for places she has never been in this body, for people she has never met in this timeline, for a daughter who in this life is not here and in those other lives is grown and thriving, and who Lori can still feel, whose face she can still see as clearly as she can see anything, whose laugh she can still hear, and she says there are mornings when this reality feels thin to her, feels like a watercolor version of something that exists in a richer medium somewhere else. And she says she knows how that sounds, and she is not romanticizing it, and she is not saying she wants to die. She is very specifically not saying that. She is saying that the experience of having briefly inhabited the full version of what consciousness might be makes the constrained local version feel like a significant diminishment. And Bernard says quietly, without the laugh this time, I feel exactly the same way, and that's what worries me most. Not the memories, not the door, but the fact that this, he gestures around at the coffee shop, the ordinary world, the tables and the cups and the people moving through, ordinary Tuesday afternoon life that this feels like it's lost some kind of resolution it used to have, like looking at something in standard definition after having briefly seen it in a format that doesn't have a name yet. The memory integration question is one that near-death researchers have been grappling with for decades, because one of the most consistent features of profound near-death experiences is the life review, the experience of not just remembering one's life but experiencing it completely, every moment accessible simultaneously, every emotional consequence felt from both sides, every interaction understood from inside both the self and the other, a total integration of all experience into a single simultaneous knowing. And what is significant about this from a neuroscience perspective is that it is the opposite of how ordinary memory works. Ordinary memory is sequential, associative, reconstructive, imperfect, filtered through the limitations of attention and encoding and the particular emotional state of the moment of recall. But the memory integration reported in near-death experiences is complete and simultaneous and equally vivid across all moments, which is precisely the kind of non-local total access that you might expect from a consciousness that had temporarily shed the filter of the biological brain and was accessing something more complete, something more directly connected to the quantum field in which all information about all experience is simultaneously present, not stored sequentially in a local biological structure, but accessible all at once from within a non-local field. Bernard has started keeping a notebook, not a research notebook, a personal one, in which he writes down the details of the other life as he remembers them, and he is careful to note in the introduction to the notebook that he is a neuroscientist, and he is aware that false memories are a real phenomenon and that the experience of certainty about a memory is not reliable evidence of that memory's accuracy. He is aware of all of this, and he is keeping the notebook anyway, because the details keep being there when he reaches for them. The specific quality of light in the office where the respected version of himself worked, the specific sound of applause at a lecture where people actually remembered his name. Afterward, the specific feeling of mattering in a way that this version of his life has not consistently provided. And he writes it all down because it feels like the responsible thing to do with information that keeps insisting it is real, even if he does not yet know what kind of real it is. And sometimes late at night he reads back through the notebook, and he thinks, very quietly, that he is not entirely sure whether this is the primary life or a secondary one, not in a way that destabilizes his ability to function, but in a way that sits in the background of everything he does, like a question that keeps not quite finding its answer. Lori says she has thought a great deal about whether the lives she experienced on the other side were wishes or memories. She has sat with this question for 7 years, and she has not definitively resolved it. But she says there is something she keeps noticing that seems relevant, which is that the lottery win and the ocean house and the grown daughter who survived were not the version of those things that she would have wished for if you had asked her before the accident what she would wish for. They were specific in ways that wishes are not usually specific. They had textures and details and emotional qualities that pure wish fulfillment does not usually carry. The granddaughter in the other life, for instance, had a specific quality of stubbornness that Lori found both familiar and mildly exasperating in the way that real people are exasperating, rather than in the way that idealized wish fulfillment figures are lovable. And she says that specificity, that texture, that sense of a life that was genuinely lived by a genuine person with genuine complications, felt more like memory than like wish, and she says she cannot prove that. She is not trying to prove it, but she notices it, and noticing it matters to her. Toward the end of one of their conversations, sitting in the same coffee shop they had been meeting in for 2 years, Bernard said something that surprised Lori because it surprised him. He said, "I think I have stopped being afraid of death, not in a way that makes me careless about living, but in the specific way that fear of death is usually a fear of ending, a fear of the lights going out permanently, a fear of simply ceasing, and I find that I no longer carry that particular fear because what I experienced, even in the limited artificial version of it that the simulation provided, does not feel like it is pointing toward ending." And Lori said, "What does it feel like it's pointing toward?" And Bernard said, quietly, "Continuation." Not the specific personal Bernard Vale continuation that ego would prefer, but continuation in some form, the consciousness that briefly expanded beyond its local constraints did not feel like it was approaching its end. It felt like it was approaching something more complete. And Lori said yes, and Bernard said the scientific version of that is that consciousness may be more fundamental than we assumed, may be more connected to the underlying field than the local brain can normally allow through. And the death of the brain may not be the same thing as the ending of what the brain was temporarily expressing. And Lori said that is almost exactly what it felt like. And Bernard said, "I know. And the fact that I know that from the inside now is the thing I have been least sure how to categorize for the past 3 years. And Lori said, "You don't have to categorize it." And Bernard said, "I know, but I'm a scientist. Categorizing things is my primary coping mechanism." And Lori said that's also probably true in all the other lives. And Bernard said, "Almost certainly, the other version of me definitely over-categorizes." And Lori laughed, and Bernard laughed, and outside the coffee shop window, the ordinary world continued doing what it does, which is being ordinary, being local, being constrained, being the specific watercolor version of something that might exist in richer form elsewhere. And both of them sat with that for a moment before ordering more coffee. The final act of this story takes place at the ocean, because it was always going to take place at the ocean, because some locations insist on themselves with a specificity that neither Lori nor Bernard had any rational explanation for, and that they had both long since stopped trying to explain away. They drove 3 hours to a coastline that Bernard had identified from the specific quality of the light in his memory of the simulation. Not confidently, not with certainty. He said this might not be the right ocean, and Lori said there's only one way to find out, and Bernard said that is either very reassuring or very ominous, and Lori said probably both, and they drove the 3 hours, and they parked, and they walked down toward the water, and the light was doing what late afternoon light does. Beside cold water, which is something that does not have an adequate name in ordinary language, something between gold and gray, something that makes the world feel simultaneously more substantial and more fragile than it normally does, and they stood at the edge of the water for a while without saying anything. And then Lori said there, and Bernard followed her gaze, and standing in the sand, perhaps 40 meters down the shoreline, freestanding, unattached to any structure, its red paint slightly faded by salt and weather, exactly as they had both seen it in their respective impossible encounters with whatever lay on the other side of ordinary consciousness, was the door. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. They stood and looked at it the way you stand and look at something when the act of looking is sufficient for the moment, when the fact of its being there is the important thing, and any further action can wait while the being there settles into reality. And Bernard said very quietly, "Huh?" And Laurie said, "Yes." And Bernard said, "I want to note for the record that I am aware this cannot be adequately explained, and that I am also aware that my inability to adequately explain it does not make it not real." "And Laurie," said Bernard, and he said, "Yes." And she said, "Stop doing the scientist thing for 5 minutes." And he said, "I literally do not know how to do that." And she said, "I know." She said, "I know." And she put her hand on his arm the way you put your hand on someone's arm when you are trying to say something that does not fit in words. And they looked at the red door beside, the gloomy ocean in the late afternoon light. And Bernard said quietly, "I genuinely no longer believe that death is the end. Not the way I used to believe it might be." And Laurie said she knew, and he said, "What do you believe?" And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Maybe we were never dying, maybe we were remembering." And the waves came in the way waves do, patient and indifferent and beautiful, and the door stood in the sand the way. Impossible things stand when they have decided to be undeniable, and the light did its nameless thing between gold and gray, and the question of what consciousness is, and where it lives and whether it ends or only changes form hung in the salt air between them, without requiring an answer, comfortable in its own uncertainty, vast and specific at the same time, like everything that matters most. Here is what we know, and here is what we do not know, and here is why the distinction matters. We know that the dying brain produces surges of gamma wave activity that are the neural signature of high-level conscious processing. We know that people who survive cardiac arrest consistently report experiences that are organized and coherent and emotionally rich rather than chaotic. We know that quantum theories of consciousness are being taken increasingly seriously by researchers who are not mystics but physicists and neuroscientists grappling honestly with phenomena that the conventional framework is struggling to accommodate. We know that the question of whether consciousness is generated by the brain or expressed through it has not been definitively answered, and that the data being collected is not straightforwardly supporting only one answer: what we do not know is whether the experiences Laurie and Bernard describe reflect genuine access to something beyond ordinary consciousness, or are extraordinarily vivid and emotionally significant products of a brain under extreme conditions. What we do not know is whether the quantum field that underlies physical reality carries information about consciousness in a way that individual brains can sometimes access. What we do not know is whether the red door is a shared memory or a coincidence or something that language does not yet have a word for. What we know is that these questions matter. They matter because if consciousness is more than the brain, if awareness is more fundamental to the structure of reality than conventional science has assumed, if the boundary between this life and whatever lies beyond it is more permeable than the ordinary experience of being mortal suggests, then everything about how human beings understand their own existence, their own value, Their own connection to each other and to the universe they inhabit needs to be reconsidered, and Quantaverse exists precisely for this kind of reconsidering, for the questions that sit at the boundary of what is known and what is only beginning to be, measured for the conversations that require both scientific rigor and the willingness to be genuinely open to what the evidence might be pointing toward. Once awareness begins, nothing ever looks the same again.